sessions. For a bit of context, this work kind of goes back 10 years ago to some work that I was then doing at Oxford, where what became clear as I started a research project around taxation is that the quality of data available was, in a sense, not only too weak to support some of the research findings that were out there, but also a clear obstacle to any improvement on those research findings. It's been a long time to get to this point, and Wilson in particular has done the vast bulk of the work in making sure that we did get here. Given that 10-year span, I hope you will forgive us if we go at quite a pace over the next couple of hours in order to get to the discussion around, with all the information on the table, to get to the discussion around where we can go next. And we, I mean all of us and our institutions. Okay, given that, I'm going to hand straight over to Will to present the data set and set out some of the workings behind it and the rationale for some of the decisions that underpin it. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. Two things, I guess, quickly to start. The first thing is just to say thank you to everyone for being here. The data set itself is already the culmination of about 3 years of work. And as you can imagine, this is the kind of thing that you always worry people might not be very interested in, something so sort of technical and specific. So we're just really thrilled to see so many people here, and really a lot of very sort of senior people, a lot of people very expert in this field. We wish we had twice as much time to discuss, precisely because there's so many people here who know so much about these questions. For that very reason, then the second thing is just to re-emphasize Alex's apologies for the sort of tight schedule and the sort of pace at which we'll be moving along. But I hope everyone will bear with us, because we do think it's probably the best way to get the information out and then leave some time for a really interesting discussion at the end of the day. So my goal in this first session is just to introduce the data sets. It's not going to be as detailed as what you can find in the working paper that I think everyone will have found at their seat. But for those who haven't had a chance to look at that, I'm going to try to provide a pretty clear picture of what we've done, but also of some of the limitations of what we've done looking forward. Broadly speaking, as Alex has suggested, the motivation for doing this has been a view that the quality of available international data, for a variety of reasons that I'll get into, has not been sufficient to sustain really high-quality research on tax and development, and a corresponding fear that some of the things that we think are true may not actually be true if we had a stronger foundation of data. With that in mind, broadly what we've done is we've taken a variety of different international sources of tax data, and we've quite meticulously and carefully sought to combine them, drawing on their various strengths in order to make a composite database that is both more complete and more accurate than available alternatives. And we think, broadly speaking, that we've succeeded in doing that, including dealing much more systematically and consistently with natural resource revenues. With that said, we don't view this as a replacement for the work being done by the IMF, by the OECD, by CEPAL, and by other organizations gathering data. Right? This is very much a complement. This is a tool that is particularly useful for researchers who need relatively complete data in particular in order to do good, high-quality research, and also a tool for policymakers looking to make broader comparisons. But we're keenly aware of the limitations of any process based on merging data from different sources. And at the end of the day, the quality of what we can do here is constrained very much by the quality of the data that the IMF, the OECD, and others are able to collect from country offices. Right? So in the short term, this is a tool for researchers. It does more for research than what those international databases can do. But we view these very much as complementary processes, and that's part of what we want to get into in the discussion at the end of the day. And that, in some ways, is very much not just about discussion, but about trying to encourage cooperation, consensus about what is the best way forward in order for us collectively to be able to provide the best data possible for research and for policy across these various agencies. With that overview in mind, I'll sort of go through 4 parts in this presentation. First, just a bit more about that motivation. Second, a detailed description of the construction of the data. I'll then discuss briefly the limitations, because we want to be very transparent about those limitations. And then I'll say a bit about the lessons learned and next steps. By way of motivation, again, the motivation is quite straightforward. Right? A fear that the weaknesses of available international tax data may be leading to research that is at best not very robust and at worst misleading. Not because anyone's seeking to mislead, but because the data itself is misleading. Because the way in which the missing data that we have is not random, but in fact is systematic. This isn't just our view that international data is not sufficiently strong for research, but by now a collective view. Most research that's been done over the past decade on tax and development questions has been based on composite and ad hoc data sets. That is, data sets compiled by specific groups of researchers to answer specific research questions, often by merging data from different sources. Right? So we're in that tradition, but we think that we've done it more carefully and more robustly than those earlier efforts. And to us, that's critical. Because while earlier research based on these ad hoc data sets has yielded new insights, the problem with ad hoc data sets is precisely that they are ad hoc. They're hard to replicate, they're hard to check, there are huge scope for errors to creep in during that process because of the complexity of the process. Right? If we want to build knowledge in this area, we don't just need high quality data, but we all need to be using the same data. Because if we're not using the same data, it's very hard to combine research findings and therefore build that body of knowledge. When I talk about the weaknesses of existing sources, let me just enumerate a few because they provide context to what we've done. The most obvious is missing data. If you go into the IMF's government finance statistics, which is the sort of broadest source of data across countries, you discover that particularly for lower income countries, you might be missing as much as 40 or 50% of country year observations. That reflects the quality of data flowing to the IMF, but nonetheless poses major problems for research, because you can't do reliable econometric research if you're missing half of your data. Regional databases have begun to fill those gaps. We now have regional data sets, particularly for Latin America, that are much more complete. The trouble with regional data sets, of course, though, is they only cover one region. And they're not always entirely comparable to other regions, so they alone don't fully solve our problem. Many of the data sources we have similarly don't deal with non-tax revenue. So a number of data sets cover tax revenues within countries, but by failing to consider non-tax revenue, they don't reveal the entire envelope of resources available to governments. To me, and I think to most researchers, that is a huge omission, because without that broader context, it's hard to make arguments about tax and development questions. We similarly find that in almost all of those international data sets, an inconsistent treatment of natural resource wealth. Right? Sometimes natural resources are taxes, sometimes they're non-tax revenue. But that inconsistency can give a profoundly misleading view of what taxes countries are raising, because more often than not, what we really want to know is how much non-resource tax revenue are countries collecting. But often our data sets can't tell us that. When we think about researcher data sets, a few additional problems arise. One is an incomplete range of revenue categories. If I produce a new data set for my piece of research, I produce the revenue categories that I need. But again, that means that data set's not useful more broadly. And similarly, you just find simple errors in those data sets, right? When you start merging data sets, the risk of errors creeping in is enormous. Partially, we've tried to guard against that through a very detailed process of manual data cleaning, which I'll describe. But in part, making this transparent and public is part of how we want to guard against the errors that have crept into earlier data sets. And finally, and this draws largely on work that's been publicized by Morten Jerven, who's here, are problems with GDP series, right? I can have the best tax data in the world, but if the GDP series I'm using is wrong, all of that data falls apart when I throw it into my analysis. And so we've tried to look long and hard at that issue. The basic motivation for our approach, which relies on merging data from different sources, is reflected in this graph. Right? And it's a simple observation that although individual sources have systematic missing data in different places, often those gaps can be filled with other data sets, right? So if the World Bank's data doesn't cover these years, well, it turns out that IMF Article 4 reports can fill those years, right? And so this just suggests that by merging different data sets, we might be able to fill those gaps, but also correct some of the errors that I was talking about. So I want to describe in a bit of detail the construction of the data set, and I'll just go through these 7 steps, which I'll leave you to read so we keep moving quickly. The first thing we needed to do was arrive at a standard revenue classification. That is, what categories do we want? And you won't be able to read this, so let me just point out the key points. For the most part, we follow the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, and all other organizations in the broad categories that we use. There are only really three things I would say about our classification that are noteworthy and worth thinking about. The first, again, is we look at tax and non-tax revenue, right? So we're looking at the complete envelope of government revenue, not just at their taxes. The second is we try to account more systematically for revenue from natural resources. Again, we're interested primarily in non-resource tax revenue, which means we try to draw a distinction between tax revenue from natural resources and tax revenue from non-resource sources so that we can see that distinction in the data. And you'll see that in the data set, we have categories for resource tax revenue and non-resource tax revenue, wherever we're able to do that. And the third is dealing with social contributions. Different international sources treat social contributions differently. And if you're not careful about that, when you merge data, you can get major inconsistencies arising. So we've just made sure that all of our data is reported inclusive and exclusive of social contributions in order to create clarity and simplify the merging process. Having developed that classification, we identified these data sources as the best data sources available for our purpose as of 2011, which is when we started this process. So that's the IMF GFS data pre and post 1990, and of course there's some differences there that we've tried to pay attention to. The OECD's data, CEPAL data for Latin America. More recently, the OECD's collaboration with CEPAL for data in Latin America. The OECD's data for Africa through the African Economic Outlook, the World Bank's data, and one researcher database, which is by Keenan Mansour from the IMF. And hopefully people will be familiar with some of those. Having compiled that initial set of sources, our goal was to create a single data set in which you could look up for any country year every available source of data and compare them, right? So I could say in Guatemala in 1996, we have data from 4 sources, and this is what they look like. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're a little different. And by comparing them, we're then able to identify, well, what is the best available source for that country year, bearing in mind what's available also for surrounding years. Having compiled that data, we then moved on to compiling information from IMF Article 4 reports. The Article 4 reports, for those who are not familiar with them, are country-level reports compiled by IMF country offices, which contain tax and revenue data, often at quite a good level of disaggregation, particularly during the 90s and early 2000s. Our vision was that that data could be used to fill gaps in the other data sources. But again, there's a need for caution here, and the IMF would tell us about this. That data is not checked and verified as carefully as data from the government finance statistics. And there are ever-changing categorizations of data, both across countries and within countries over time. Right? So compiling that data, we want to be aware of its limitations, but we also needed to be very, very careful in the way that we combined it to make sure that our categories are consistent over time so that our time series are valid. For the most part, as we've used that data, we've tried to make sure that it looks more or less the same as surrounding data from other sources. If it doesn't, we can't trust it. If it does, we've gone ahead. But again, we want to note those limitations. And here for Albania, you can see the way in which the blue line, which is the Article 4 data, fills in various gaps in the data from other sources. The next step then has been to deal with natural resource revenue. Again, inconsistency in the treatment of natural resource revenue is a major problem in any of these international data sets because resource revenues are sometimes tax revenue, sometimes non-tax revenue. And that can obscure the variable we really care about, which is non-resource tax revenue for the most part. So our task here has been to strip out the resource component of tax revenue so that we have a consistent time series for each country for non-resource tax revenue while moving the resource revenue component of tax revenue into a broadly defined non-tax revenue category, itself divided into its resource and non-resource components. Again, this raises a range of challenges, but for the most part, we've relied on Article 4 reports to help us to do that because they often distinguish the resource component of revenue. But as I'll return to, it's imperfect. But the consequences are clear here, right? Before you adjust for the resource component of tax revenue, a country like Angola is the best tax collector in the world. It's collecting 50% of GDP in tax revenue. Once you account for natural resources, it's collecting 5% of GDP in taxes, and it's one of the worst tax collectors in the world. For my purposes, the second figure is the one I want, because that's the real story that I want to capture. But you can imagine, if you don't correct for that, any econometric analysis is going to be deeply flawed. A series of smaller other issues worth mentioning. Again, we deal with social contributions in order to ensure a consistent approach across sources, particularly important, again, when merging different sources that may treat social contributions differently. We try to deal with the problem of federal states. If you only rely on central government revenue, which many studies do, you may vastly underestimate the amount of revenue being collected by federal states, Brazil, India, China. So what we've done is compile data for central government and for general government. And then in a sort of final composite version of the data set, we combine the two. We use central government data where that's the only thing available. If we have general government data, and if it looks reliable and is significantly larger than central government data, we substitute it in, because we believe that that's the way we provide the most reliable picture of actual fiscal extraction in different countries. The last piece is direct and indirect taxes. Some databases include variables for direct and indirect, these composite variables. Others don't. We calculate that throughout because we find that that's a relatively complete data series that we're able to construct across countries. So that's our tax data. Out of that, we think we have very good, though certainly not perfect, tax data. But again, the GDP data is the other side of this coin and critical. Because if the denominator of our tax to GDP ratios is wrong, the whole thing falls apart. And we know there are problems here, and let me just simplify them a little bit. One problem is simply that all our GDP series are a little different. If you go to the World Bank and the IMF, or different parts of the IMF, you'll get different numbers, right? And at a minimum, we want to know which one we're using because that's giving us slightly different results. But there are also deeper problems. We know that in many countries, GDP may be vastly underestimated, owing often to the failure to rebase GDP as economies change. And so we might find a country that seems to collect an enormous amount of tax revenue as a share of GDP, but that's not reflecting their tax collection, that's reflecting the failure to measure GDP effectively. And worse still, often when rebasing exercise is happening, as probably everyone here will know, you can see huge jumps in GDP from one year to the next. And that can result in a huge decline in the tax to GDP ratio, but which has no relationship to what's actually happened. So we need to make sure we're using a GDP series that accounts for those jumps and smooths them out so that our final time series is usable. And we can see the use of that here in Ghana, which underwent a rebasing exercise in 2010. Before the rebasing exercise, we see that different sources, when relying on their own GDP series, are sharply divergent. But for these series, we then have a sharp fall in tax revenue when the rebasing exercise happens. That's obviously problematic, but in many of the data sets being used for research, that data is in there. And so that's distorting our results. If we then construct a common GDP series that is smooth for those rebasing exercises, all of the data lines up. And so that's what we've done in our process. And then the final thing to mention is manual cleaning of the data. In principle, you'd think you could automate this, right? You'd say we have a first source, our baseline source, and when there are gaps, we'll fill it automatically from other sources. This would work if all of the sources were the same and they matched, but they don't. So if you automate that process and simply fill missing data automatically where it exists, you get discontinuities in the data series, right? It means you merge an OECD data point with an IMF data point, but they don't match up. And so you have big problems for any kind of analysis you want to conduct. The result is you need someone to go through year by year and check that data, make sure we're using the right source, make sure when we merge two sources that they match up and overlap. Vanessa, who's over here down at the end, did much of the work of doing that for this project. If you see her over coffee, congratulate her. It's a terrible task. I think between Vanessa and others, they probably spent 6 or 9 months combing through this data set, trying to find those problems, then figure out how to fix them. And it's really important to emphasize, though, that's the big difference in some ways between this and other initiatives like this, is the level of detail in trying to clean up those problems. And we think it's worth it. We think the data set's much more accurate now. We also have much better data coverage. These numbers could vary slightly depending on which version of the data sets you have, but more or less, our data set for developing countries covers 50+% more observations than the IMF GFS. It also covers significantly more observations than a similar exercise undertaken inside the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department. Right? So we have much better data coverage, significantly greater accuracy, and that's what it is that we think this data set is contributing. let me just quickly say a few things that are about limitations and lessons learned. Because the limitations are important because they point toward what remains to be done. Most obviously, we're still missing a lot of data, right? We have a lot more data than other sources, but there's still a lot missing. And that reflects the absence of any data at all in any international source, right? That depends on capacity building in country and the work of international organizations in that regard. The second thing is continuing challenges in dealing with resource revenues. For some countries, we simply cannot distinguish resource revenues from tax revenues. Those countries, they can't be used for analysis. There aren't that many, but there are a few. For many countries, once we identify resource revenue, we still can't distinguish between resource and non-resource types of non-tax revenue, right? I would love to have a series that is total resource revenue by country for every year in our data set. We don't have that because countries that have very little resource revenue, it doesn't get reported. And for some countries, again, it gets pooled in with other non-tax revenue. We'd like a system that can pull those things apart, but no source allows us to do that. And more broadly, there are definitional issues, right? What is resource revenue? You know, is a sales tax on a resource firm resource revenue or not, right? Are things imported by someone who contracts for a resource firm resource revenue or not? There's no single answer to that question, but if we want to do good analysis, we would like to have a common definition to work from so we're all working in the same way. And again, that's where we're looking to international organizations, and as we'll hear, some of that work is beginning to happen. The final one is just to say, there is variation across sources that I can't explain. I'm not sure anyone can explain it. If you put all these sources next to each other, the data often isn't quite the same across sources. If you look at those IMF country reports, the Article 4 reports, they don't perfectly match either, right? So there's still problems of data quality embedded in this, and that also means that some of the data choices we make are somewhat subjective. We don't want to hide that. Instead, we'd like to make it transparent. People can see it. You can see the choices we've made, and we hope that that's a good basis on which researchers generally, and maybe international organizations as well, will see this as a useful source from which we can collectively work in order to have greater comparability. A few quick notes about lessons and next steps, and I'll wrap up. The first one is just resource revenues are critical, right? If we don't deal with distinguishing non-resource tax from resource tax, there's almost no point doing this because the analysis is going to be meaningless. I know that there are efforts now underway with international organizations to do that. But it's also important to integrate that with other revenue rate, other data gathering. That's very distracting. There have been initiatives at the IMF, at the IADB in recent years to separately gather data on resource revenues by country. That's a good start. But what we really need is to integrate that data with our major data sets on government revenue, right? So that we can say for any country, here's the non-resource tax, here's the resource tax. Here's the non-resource non-tax, here's the resource non-resource, or resource non-tax revenue. Because that's what we really need for analytical purposes. But that means that these different initiatives have to be pulled together. They need to be coordinated because right now they're a bit disparate. The second thing is, again, GDP figures. They're critical, right? There's a lot of work to make them better. But at a minimum, what we know is if there's going to be a government revenue database, everyone should know transparently what is the GDP series that's being used. We should make sure that that GDP series accounts for problems related to GDP rebasing. And it should be easy for users to to change the GDP series, to play with that, right? There are certainly data sets out there today where the GDP series is not reported at all, so we don't know where the GDP series comes from, or where the user doesn't have access to it. If we know that GDP series are problematic, then that whole data set becomes problematic. So that's another lesson learned. The third lesson learned, very clear, and again, I'm repeating myself, we need tax and non-tax revenue. Right? As a researcher, it's not terribly useful to only have tax data. I need the whole picture of government finances to be able to draw real conclusions about problems of government finance and taxation. The fourth is, as you go through an exercise like this, you can't help but think to yourself, couldn't we coordinate this work better? Right? We have lots of people in the room who have worked on data from the IADB, from the IMF, from the OECD, from the World Bank. Within the IMF, you have different groups doing this work. Institutional coordination is hard, but as you look with all those different data sets which overlap but are different and don't fit together, you think to yourself, if we want to do this better, we need to get those things harmonized more effectively, or at least that's certainly one of our goals in convening this discussion. And the last message is just one about composite data sets and the stuff we've been working with, right? Is merging data sets is one thing, merging data sets well is a very different thing. And if you don't merge data together really, really carefully, inevitably there are going to be errors and mistakes. We've spent a lot of time trying to account for those things. Again, that's why we hope this will be a useful resource and one that people will adopt. But we also find it useful just to flag how careful one needs to be so that we can have a realistic appraisal of alternative efforts like this that are already in the literature or may come in the future. So I'll stop there. Thank you very, very much for your attention, and we'll open up to some discussion.
Thank you. I realise I neglected to make two possibly important announcements before. The first is that this is being recorded, and I hope everyone is happy with that. The idea that we'll probably put it up afterwards will certainly, ICTD will create a transcript. So shriek if that doesn't work for you. The second thing is if everyone who's online, with the exception of our next discussant, could mute themselves, that would be greatly appreciated.
Particularly people on the phone line. People on the phone line need to mute themselves.
Anyone on the phone line, I'm told in particular. But we are really very lucky to have as a discussant Michael Ross of UCLA. Michael, are you online?
I am indeed. Can you hear me?
We can, and the floor is yours. If you'd like to, for I think 5 to 7 minutes, give us your reaction to Wilson's presentation.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I have to say, before I talk about Wilson's presentation, I have to tell you about something that happened last night. As a hobby, I try out different recipes, and I have to report to the people in this room that I found out that Julia Child's famous recipe for making a brioche is a complete fraud. Okay, and nobody there should ever try it. And I'll tell you why. Because she has this beautiful recipe. It only has a handful of ingredients, right? So I made it, right? It was pretty simple. It calls for butter. I didn't have butter, so I used the margarine that was around in the refrigerator. It calls for flour. I had a container that I thought was flour. It might have been the plaster of Paris that my son needs for this project. And it calls for 3 eggs. And I didn't have the 3 eggs, but I did have 3 ping pong balls, which kind of look like eggs. And so I smashed them and I put it all together and put it in the oven. It was a complete disaster. Okay. I'm joking, but I'm obviously discussing how social scientists have been doing their research on these incredibly important issues for decades now, right? We have our ideas, we have our theories that we want to test, and what do? We go and download some data set whose provenance we know very little about, that contains information that is aggregated through a mysterious process from some selection of countries. I would say random, but they're probably not random because there are patterns of missingness that are non-random and are going to bias our results. And so adding these unknown ingredients to our models seems to not trouble us at all. And instead, we just go ahead and write our papers and report our results as though we have meaningful findings. Okay. What this project has done, what the ICTD project has done, is, I think, unmask some of the fictions that we abide by and that we rely on. This was like a great sort of emperor has no clothes exercise. What this group has done is show us and talk frankly about a problem that many of us have recognized but just haven't known how to deal with, which is that the data we use to make inferences about very big issues, very important questions about taxes and state formation, about economic performance, about accountability, about the effects of resource revenues, all of these big things, we just really don't know what's going on because we don't have meaningful data on many of these quantities. When I first met Will Prichard about 2 years ago, I was really very unfair to him because we sat down and he told me about this project, and I think he got about 2 sentences out of his mouth before I spent the next hour haranguing him about how incredibly important this was and what a revolution it would create. I've been a huge fan of this project ever since then. I bothered him and his colleagues every 3 months or so to see how it's going. And I'm very, very excited that the data are finally going live, that they're finally available for other researchers to use. They've produced a fantastic set of about 5 or 6 papers showing what we can learn just from some initial examination of the data. That, in fact, many of the things, some of the big things that we thought about the effects of aid, about the effects of tax collection, are mistaken or at least misestimated in a very serious way. I think this is the beginning of an effort to take much more seriously our empirical analysis, and it's going to really produce some important new insights, and indeed has already done so. One final point, which is that for those of us who are interested in resource revenues and resource issues, this is just going to represent a sea change. As many of you know, we're already sort of on the threshold of a data revolution in this area. That is, with EITI, with Dodd-Frank, with the EU directive, with all kinds of transparency initiatives, we're just starting to get a whole flood of new data available about resource revenues and resource payments. Okay? The problem is that we haven't yet figured out how to manage them in a systematic way, to analyze them in a systematic way, and we don't have yet, at least up until today, up until this project, a reliable time series that we can use to make comparisons going backwards and looking forward. So this comes at a perfect time for those of us who focus on this issue, those of us who care about this issue. The great example that Will gave of Angola, how you might radically change your estimate of how well it's doing based on having complete data on its actual GDP and its actual revenue collection. Okay, just gives you a tiny picture of how much this is going to change what we know and what we can do. So it's not only a data revolution, but I think a revolution in the way that people take seriously data that they use, the data that they have in front of them. Not only do we have a lot more available, but this project has showed us how much more seriously we need to take these issues. And I'm very excited to see that it's available now. I'm delighted to be here as part of this rollout today. So thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you very much, Michael. I know the team who worked on this really appreciate your support. Can we open this up? We're running happily a little bit ahead of time, even. So it would be great to get thoughts. Those of you who've had a look at the database, or those of you who are now seeing for the first time in Will's presentation. Perhaps particularly those of you who worked on the statistical side, but I think broadly.
First of all, I want to say this is a great initiative, and I agree with all the enthusiasm behind it. But coming from a statistical angle, I think that there should be a great caveat in that we're not increasing the accuracy of the data. We're increasing the number of observations to look at, whereas the accuracy itself is something that's more of a fundamental problem. If you go to these non-random countries where statistics either aren't being produced or of low quality, this is because they don't have infrastructure, they don't have human capital, they don't have training. So basically we can take what exists now, which is bad data, and put it in a centralized database, but we still have a centralized database of core data. So while I agree with the initiative and I really like what's happening here, and it's nice to even open people's eyes to there is different methodologies behind the data that's being compiled, international organizations need to work more closely together on having a common methodology and a common template, so on and so forth. We should still bear in mind that garbage in, garbage out always holds, no matter where you're putting the data or how centralized the data is. But you note lots of these in the paper as well, but I just wanted to make sure that that's caveated throughout this whole conversation.
Thanks. There could hardly be a better segue to Morten Jerven.
Exactly, yes. Yeah.
No, I think, thanks. And just to follow up on that, I wasn't going to lambast you for bad quality data and so forth. I think you've done a really nice job of actually trying to lay bare some of the limitations. I think that's the way to go ahead as well. Balancing that act between, presenting something that is usable at the same time showing what ways it is still may be misleading, and therefore not kind of putting a cosmetic kind of fix on things, so that the other actors who should be really urgent about improving the data going forward get the wrong idea. But I think it's also worthwhile maybe thinking about this in the questions of there's a distinction between validity and reliability. So that what you're trying to do is to harmonize, and therefore having the same mismeasurement in all countries, to put it that way. So that all bathroom scales are wrong, but if they're all wrong the same way, that's okay to compare each other's weight. But if they're wrong in different ways, you have problems. And so I think that's what you're doing, but actually not actually. It's a bit different to actually increase validity of each and every bathroom scale, which might shape, really shape the foundations of your whole data set if you went down that route. So I understand why you would do that. I just wanted to have two simple questions, which I don't know whether you thought about. One is, are you planning to bring this further back in time? 1990 is a short time frame for many of us who are interested in long-term changes, particularly political economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Many developing countries have been, overgeneralizing here, but been kind of consistent from 1990 until today. What's really interesting is to see the big long-term changes from colonial regimes to ISI dependencies, cool kind of things, and then into the new era to get some long-term trends. That would be, I'm an economic historian, so that's one thing. The other one is, you're relying very much on the share of GDP. I understand why that's, for comparative sakes. Have you done any thinking at all to thinking about being innovative about this, coming up with other ratios, other ways of doing this? I mean, thinking a little bit outside the box on that. Whether you have any ideas there?
Okay. And we take a question from Jim, and then I'll ask Walter.
Sure. I had another level of thought about this. That is that you're working on something that is going to have a lot of technical value, and it will be very important for researchers. And what I'm concerned about is the value that it will have to the people who compile and report, and the incentives that they will have to produce better data, because sometimes the data is bad because people are happy to have bad data. They really don't want to improve it. And have you thought about that next political level of incentives for getting to the point where you have more uniformity and more participation? It can't be just teaching people to do things because sometimes they know better, but aren't really interested.
Shall I respond?
Yeah, please.
Now and in future, I'll try to be sort of brief, but they're great questions, so I'm happy to talk offline. I think Mike's caveat, I think, is just generally well placed. Our sense of this data to some, the most cynical view of this data is people are out there doing research anyway, and the foundation we think we had before was really, really bad. This one's better, and better is certainly better is better, but better is not perfect, and I think so. The point is well taken, and very much, deep down, our sort of goal here would be to say, if this meeting helps in some small way to sort of spur attention to the importance of gathering better data, that's a great outcome. I mean, we do think it's worth saying that, because we try to look at so many different sources across individual countries, we do think genuinely that this data is more accurate than other composite data that's out there, because we think we've cleaned out a lot of, the worst stuff. If there's something really bad in there, then when you start comparing across sources, you say, this is a complete disaster, this doesn't make any sense, well, we're going to throw that out. So we cleared out a little bit of the worst stuff. But yeah, for various countries, these are probably best understood as approximations more than anything. This leads a bit into then to Morten's question about what else could we do with the data. So going further back in time, I would love to go further back in time. I think the problem is the further you try to go back in time, the worse the data you have to draw on gets, I think, and just the harder it is to find. We have the data set itself goes back to 1980. So because that was how far back we thought we could take it, because back to 1980, you do have IMF Article 4 reports. You have the GFS goes back, but you also have some overlapping sources. So it gives you some scope to say, well, do we at least have some consistency across sources? Do we trust this data? And can we get some degree of completeness? But the country coverage declines by about half as you go from 1990 back to 1980. So you start to lose a lot of data, and you start to have some data where, the eyeball test says, I don't know if I really buy it. So for a lot of the analysis that you'll see in the papers to follow, we test it with data back to 1980, and we test with data back to 1990. And we always hope that we'll get the same results both ways. But I think that earlier data, we want to give that signal, rather than claiming to have more than we do, we'd rather be honest and say, we think you should be a little careful with that data, because we just don't think there's a good foundation out there. But we do have it in there, and I think there's value to doing the analysis with both. The share of GDP business, yes, I'll turn to the share of GDP. I mean, first, I guess I could just tell the story I told you a minute ago, but I'll tell everyone about, the problem with using the share of GDP. If we go out and talk to tax administrations, particularly in Africa, where these GDP problems, I guess, are particularly pronounced, but not exclusively there, and we'll talk to tax administrators, and they will say to us, we hate that international organizations want to compare us to our neighbors based on the tax to GDP ratio. Because they understand, they say, if we have a low tax to GDP ratio, it might be because we collect taxes badly, but it might be because we measure GDP really well, and our neighbors don't, right? So they sort of have this awareness that tax to GDP ratios used crudely for comparison can actually be quite misleading, because they may be driven entirely by the GDP. And we certainly have examples of that, right? In 2008, Ghana was the best tax collector in Africa. In 2009, well, I guess in 2011, it was pretty average. My guess is the reality is that Ghana is better than average, but not the best, right? So after you rebase, suddenly you're at the bottom because your GDP is too well measured. But before you remeasure it, you're at the top because it's really badly measured. So that's the problem. And I thought, but in terms of other ratios, in one of the papers we'll present on the sort of the resource curse, we try to rely on the share of non-resource tax revenue in total government revenue. And we find that useful because then you're looking at the composition of government revenue as opposed to the level relative to GDP. In that paper, as you'll see, we do both. But it's an effort to sort of take the GDP out of that equation and look at revenue differently. But obviously, if you have other ideas about how you might get around the GDP problem, I think everyone here would be happy to hear them. And to Jim's question about, why is the data bad, the politics of this, I'm not an expert on data. I mean, Morten is, and Mike, I think probably both of them, Morten, me, and probably other people here as well, in terms of the data gathering process. My sense from both of you, but chime in if you feel different, was, sometimes people just want the data bad, but oftentimes it's just the human capacity is so low that just the data is bad because the data is bad. But I think, thinking about better data gathering, we probably want to think about both. So I take your point entirely. And mercifully, I think, we're looking to the international organizations to lead that work. But I think it's an important part of the discussion, because clearly there is a political economy part to this story. I'll stop there.
Let's take another 2 or 3, and then we should wrap up this session. So 1, 2.
One more here.
3, 4, possibly. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to briefly mention a parallel data set or effort which you may be aware of, which is being collected at the LSE in Berkeley, funded by the International Growth Center. So these two PhD students are collecting a cross-country data set on tax administration practices and tax system features. And I think that would be very nice complementary to your data set and allow us to, like the combination of the two data sets would allow us to better understand why certain countries collect more taxes than others.
Take the others, then I'll answer.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I also wanted to mention another source which could perhaps be complementary. Is the database that Georgia State University has been working on for the last 2 years that has both tax revenues and also public spending, but therefore at the revenue level is similar in the sense of trying to match IMF with OECD and other sources. So that could be another source. But then I have two questions. One is in terms of validity, because when you have found differences per country, per source, you must, have to make a decision in the end, which is the good one. Have you had any kind of endorsement, either from the countries or at the level of the contributors, the IMF, the OECD? How do they feel about the final result? Do you need that kind of endorsement? How are you going to proceed moving forward? And the other question is, what will be the the rules for accessibility? Is this going to become a public good once you are done, or what are your plans on that?
Okay, so let's take three more very quickly. So Steve and Jocelyn.
This is a really great and important contribution to sort of what we need in this area. I've been doing a lot of research on government revenue data and trends and tax policy and administration over time, and so I'm really excited to dive into this at some point, and I hope it's going to be publicly accessible. What I'm curious about on the resource revenues is how you sort of manage the process of identification and then classification of resource revenues. I ask not because I don't know what a resource tax is. There's lots of different types of resource taxes, including taxes or revenues that are realized through production sharing agreements or other types of contracts. And I wonder whether there was sort of a systematic process for dealing with those. Not just with royalties and things that were specifically called a tax, and what that process was.
Very briefly, I'm a little bit concerned about the way in which you are, if I understood correctly, aggregating in federal nations from the second level of government to the national. Because taxes are not collected for fun, right? I mean, they have, on the other side, they have some services provided. And the assumption that I think you may have implicitly made is that when you compare central government or unitary government versus federal governments, the activities of the second level of government are in the central governments at that level. Because if they are different, the comparability is not as obvious, and you may need to disaggregate more at the municipality level, but that's probably going to be really messy. Yes.
Jocelyn, did you have a last?
Yes, thank you. Positive introduction remarks and the question. Wilson, you were asking, is it a good idea? So I will start with the things that you can do and that we cannot do as international organization, and obviously you have some of them. First, you're allowing us to see our weaknesses, individual weaknesses, but also collective weaknesses as a producer of data. So thank you, especially because OECD seems to be mounting. Quite happy, but that's one point. The other thing is you obviously have a better coverage because you don't all have all the indicators. So because you take many sources, you have better coverage, and you somehow have a better accuracy because you are checking consistency between sources, so you can see discrepancies, of course. So at some point, you improve the accuracy. What you really can do, and we can't, is that you can evolve more quickly and in more directions than we can. We are completely blocked linked to the decisions that are taken by our country members. We are only a secretariat of our countries. And then, of course, we can only go in the direction and to the path that is given to us as a mandate. So you've got a freedom that we don't have. And so we've got some strengths, but not this one. And the first one is that you can have positive feedback of the research results that are done with your data. So you can improve yourself and then with the research. We can't do that because we want to stay simple. We want to stick with 20 indicators. Maybe we go to 22 one day, but we want to stay simple because simple is the condition for us to be sure and also to be comparable. And also I would like to add how far we are already struggling with OECD countries. I was saying that this morning, I mean, and even with this so rich country, it's so difficult to aggregate data for us. So we can't and we don't want to go further than that. So that was my preliminary remarks on what you can do and we can't. So thank you for doing what we can do. I would like to ask a question. From what you said and from what I read, you seem to have. Well, there was a question I was asking you by email, and it's like, can you provide us with the bridge table? I'm where's the word in English? The comparison of classifications of. I saw the nice stripe with blue and green, but
yes.
Sometimes I couldn't find my little OECD babies in that. So I think it would be useful if you can provide us very, very precise bridges between IMF and World Bank and like things, so I can make sure that, because sometimes I couldn't point my figures, my own figures, in the big Excel sheets. So, and that, from what I read, you seem to have calculated the degree of correspondence across sources sometimes. It was in.
Yeah. We have compared them. We haven't. I wouldn't say we've calculated the degree of correspondence. More that we have gone through and compared them to each other. But this has been a largely manual.
That's what I read in the note de bataille of the.
Sorry, but go ahead.
I went too far in what you wrote, but so if you did that, of course, it would be very interesting to see the calculation you made, because it's quite interesting if you take at least for like OECD countries, which are like 35 only, 34, to see IMF or World Bank figures, if we are really inconsistent or not, and to which degree. So this is more my question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay. Will, can you respond reasonably quickly to them, and we'll wrap up the session?
Absolutely. So thank you. And these are all great questions and worth pursuing further. On the initiatives that were mentioned, I would say, they sound great, and I didn't know about either of them. And I really try to know about these things, which I think only speaks to the problem, right? Researchers are off building data sets all over the place. Often they never become public. Often they just don't get enough traction to be used by others. And once that happens, it's deeply problematic because no one ever checks them. There's no external validation. And people are doing research on different numbers and getting different results. And we have no idea how they're related to each other. So I would love to know the people doing this. By all means, if you know them, I'd love to talk to them. But I think it speaks to the sort of broader dynamic. This comes just to the question from a few people about accessibility. This is accessible. It is on the internet. You can download it before the end of the meeting if you'd like. And if you download it and you find problems, we'd like to hear that you found problems. I think we will compile them, and eventually we'll go instead of do a version 2.0 kind of thing. We've had work's already been done with the data, and we found, and obviously through that you learn and correct things. And so the version we put out there we think is good. But we want that feedback. And again, part of the whole point of this is that it will be publicly available, and people can look at it, and people can disagree with it, and people can find problems, and all of those good things, which to us that's integral to this process. and unfortunately quite different to a lot of initiatives that have come before. So it's there for finding. The dealing with differences across sources. The truth is, when we've looked at sources and they don't line up, more or less what we've said is, if you have 4 sources and and 3 of them say one thing and one says something different, by and large we go with 3 instead of 1. We don't have a great way of deciding. And to be honest, it's not obvious who's particularly with its historical data, it's not obvious who's well placed to decide, right? I mean, particularly in very low income countries, I could go back and ask, but I think it's very possible that the statistics person there would be guessing as much as I am, which is just a recognition of the constraints under which they work. So, we've tried to make our best judgments. When there are big changes in data, we go and read about the history of the country. Is there some reason why we'd have certain kinds of movements in the data? But there's not a formal process of sort of, trying to use our intuition. But again, we've tried to put it there so in a way that if someone really disagreed, you could go back and figure out what we've done. The identification and classification of resource revenues, Steve, more or less we take the classification as given by the sources we have, and I say that bluntly because I don't think it's that bad an answer, but it's not a perfect answer by any stretch. Most of that data comes from IMF country reports. I think in general, IMF country reports are using, relatively similar definitions. And so, and the numbers that come out make sense. So that's, we look at this stuff, and if it looks crazy, then we say it looks crazy, and we sort of get it out of there. But it's not perfect, and it comes back to this point about, what is the right definition? Can we get a single definition so that these numbers are all really comparable? And we're not there, but we had no means of trying to do that. I mean, that's a big project, but I think a really, really important one. Can we merge central and general government data, Arturo? I think what you said is exactly right. I think there's a trade-off. You have central government data and general government data. If you put them together, it implies certain assumptions about comparability. If you keep them apart, you end up in a situation where, Brazil is one of the worst tax collectors in the world because a lot of their revenue is collected subnationally. And so I think to some extent it's a question of what error do you want to make, and to some extent just what kind of study are you doing. For the kinds of studies we've done here, we wanted to get a sense of how much tax in total do these countries collect. And so using general government data for federal states seemed to make sense. But for other kinds of projects, it won't. And in our studies in general, we tested both ways just to make sure our findings are robust. If you just use central or if you merge the two, as you'll see, we find that we often get better results in the sense of our expectations when we use general government data for federal states. So that tells me that at least for some kinds of studies, it's useful. But again, it is case specific, because everything you said is absolutely right about the dangers of doing that. And finally, Jocelyn, all the nice things you just said, I agree wholeheartedly. Thank you. I mean, but it's also very well taken. I think it picks up on some important dimensions of this. 2 things to pick up on in particular. I mean, I think the potential for iteration for us, that we do it and then we learn and people do research and we find things is really important. There are limits to how far we can take this because of resource constraints. But I think the potential for learning is really important. And in fact, we've learned a lot about this as we've gone along, right? We had the freedom to do it wrong and then discover, well, we need to do resource revenues a little differently. We need to worry more about social contributions. This source isn't matching well with this source. Why is that? And how do we make that match? So that's really useful. And I think, reflecting on the constraints faced by international organizations in doing this differently or doing it better is really important if we're serious about making it better. So, I would like to think that people in this room would say we are supporters and want to consider those things seriously. The comparison across classification systems, I think the reality is, in doing a process like this, we think it's all correct, but some of the underlying tables are a little bit messy because we learned as we went, right? And so you sort of fix things in response to what you learned. So I would love to talk to you about that and understand better what we can share with you. But there is some of the very early work that we'll share it with anyone who wants to see it, but we haven't put it online just because it's messy. We think it's more likely that people would use it badly than that they would learn from it. But in your case, I'm sure you would learn more from it than using it badly, so I'd be happy to share and talk further, but let's do that over coffee. I'll stop there.
Cool. Thank you very much, Will. Look, we are marginally ahead of schedule, so there's kind of 2 minutes for a bathroom break if anyone needs, and I will ask Paul Cliss to come up for the first research presentation. The kind of next couple of sessions we do rattle through the research with a bit less space than we've had now, but I hope it will provide an overview of the potential of this data set in thinking about existing results and how those may be made different by the data.